Is your game too complicated? Well, let's get it fixed today. Card games. A simple design is a good design. Nicholas Kingster, the blogger who's wrote this, he knows his stuff. I have just been going through this article and I am liking what I've heard. I've said it in previous videos and I am saying it again. We're going to focus it on this video. We're going with simple card designs today. So, identifying issues. It's difficult and generally unwise to try and figure out why someone else thinks the way they do. But for the purpose of this article, I'll do just that. If I had to guess why new designers so often produce clunky designs, I'd say that it's usually one of these two things. So, player perspective and design as a game. Okay, so let's get a little bit more detail on what Nicholas wanted to say here. Those who play games and those who make games have two entirely different perspectives. Designers understand the work that goes into the process and have the skills to actually create games, whereas players only ever experience games as a finished product. Many of us in game design start off as players, but for some, the transition from thinking like a player to thinking like a designer is a difficult one. The result can be a designer who creates highly complex systems because they want to be challenged as a player. And I think this is a common mistake that a lot of people actually do. You think when you want to play a game, you want increased complexity, you want to be engaged that way. As a designer, you don't want to add all that complexity all at once because you just scare the players. You need to keep things simple. Take all the bloat out of your game and just chuck it away for now. You know, we can still revisit some of those, but later, right? Lock them up. We don't need them right now. Design as a game. I think the other major cause of this problem is that some new designers treat game design itself like a game. Exactly. They try to think of it as a challenge, something that they need to beat. They create intricate designs as a way to challenge and entertain themselves, but the result is a precarious Rube Goldberg machine that few people other than themselves can actually enjoy because it wasn't meant to be enjoyed to begin with. That's it. You created this elaborate maze that nobody can discover and you think it's genius because you're the only one who can actually navigate through this maze. Well, guess what? Nobody's going to want to play your game if they can't navigate through the maze. You can say, oh, but there's a map there, but the map might be a 50-page rulebook. Players generally don't want to play with a rulebook. That's why the best complexity you can do is actually simplify your basic rules. Say, okay, you draw so many cards, you have this many phases in your game, and this is the winning objective. Now, the rest of the complexity comes through the form of the cards in the game. You've just read that rulebook in 5 minutes. You are done. The rulebook goes away. Now it is all about reading those cards, those things that actually draw people to your game. You know, you pick up these cards, you get those attachments, and you want to love those cards and learn how to play these cards. You are willing to read several hours worth of cards to absorb the knowledge and strategy of the game, but you're not willing to spend more than 5 minutes actually reading a rulebook. This is why you make the cards themselves the interesting, complex part and not the game itself. Alright, and the next thing Nicholas says is go easy on new players. So new players don't know how your game works yet, so they need a nice on-ramp into the game in form of simple, easy to comprehend cards. Too much complexity delivered too quickly is overwhelming, and it can push these new players away. With first impressions being as important as they are, new players that are scared off initially due to high complexity may never come back. And this is something I've actually addressed in my video on card rarity and the idea of not scaling the power levels in your rarities, but scaling the complexity of the cards in your rarity. Make the rarer cards the more complex ones. That way when a new player comes across your game, they are flooded with a lot of common cards which are quite simple to understand, and then a few more intricate cards later on. If you're interested in watching that video, I will put a link above my head right now so you can click on that at your leisure. But why should you appeal to new players? After all, it's the veterans that are constantly supporting you and your game, right? Well, over the course of 3 years, Hearthstone went from 10 million active users in 2014 to 70 million in 2017. That kind of growth takes more than just a good product and advertising. It requires a welcoming, newbie-friendly environment. Remember, everyone is new at one point. And this is true, and you will hear it from a lot of gamers. It doesn't take a game designer to figure this out. You know, the best example I could think of is World of Warcraft. People keep complaining that they keep adding endgame stuff and not supporting the game for newer players. Of course, I haven't played World of Warcraft in a long time, so I'm talking from an outsider's perspective. Some people may have different opinions, but people who I have spoken to about this situation with World of Warcraft say that they just add top level end game stuff and new players are just left to try and figure it out. And if you're enjoying the video and you haven't already, don't forget to gently hit that like button. Don't smash it, just give it a gentle tap, you know. We're not like those other YouTubers. We don't need to smash or destroy or obliterate the like button. Just gently tap it for me, please. You know, I don't want you to break your phone. I don't want you to break your mouse and with the little scroll wheel and everything like that. Just tap the like button, and maybe if your finger slips, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Thank you very much. And the next issue is limited memory. There's a limit on the amount of information we can stuff into our heads at once. Complex designs use up a lot of this limited memory, so the more memory we dedicate to complex designs, the less we have available when we are trying to figure out game rules or paths of play. In other words, complex cards eat up a resource that players should be dedicated to actually playing the game. Complex cards are also just flat out hard to remember, especially if they have a ton of abilities and effects. The more time a player spends struggling to remember how a card works, the less time they spend playing the game. This is 100% true. You know, usually with these articles, I end up biting back a little bit at some of the comments, but I am totally on board with what Nicholas is saying right here. So yes, this is something that I speak to Richard about regularly when we are developing Shard TCG. We need to strip back the complexity of card effects, because as soon as you have several cards on the field that are doing lots of different effects, things get complicated very, very quickly. Remember, if you are designing your own trading card game, try to keep your effects simple and diverse. That way, when there are multiple cards on the field all interacting with each other, you are not going to be wasting brain power trying to figure out exactly what's going on, because a lot of them will be more simple. The ramping up complexity of a TCG will usually come from having multiple cards on the field. So don't worry if on the surface your game appears too simple. It just makes it more accessible. Providing solutions. Okay, so let's see if Nicholas has a little bit of a different opinion from what I've been spouting out this video. So now we can finally get to the part that we probably came here to see. What can you do to improve your design skills? I've got a few tips listed below, but keep in mind that this is a matter of adjusting how you approach and think about design. It's a skill, and like all skills, it can only be acquired with practice and patience. Do one thing and do it well. When creating a card, one can be motivated to jam in a couple of effects and abilities that make the card more flexible or interesting. However, the most effective designs are usually ones that do one thing or focus on one mechanic. Yes, this is something that I have addressed in several other previous videos, and I'm loving that it is being addressed today from somebody else's point of view. It is always tempting to add multiple effects to one card to get it to do everything, but it is more fun to have two separate cards with half of the effect each. That way, when your players discover those cards, They are getting enjoyment out of discovering those two cards. They think they are clever because they put together that piece of the puzzle, and it becomes their strategy. It's not just, oh, you are using that one powerful card. No, I have figured out this combination and I have put that into the deck that I've built. Therefore, it is my genius. It is not the creator's genius who's put it there in place. It is the player's genius. You are rewarding the player that way. Bigger isn't better. Let's see what he means by this. It's easy to think of simple designs as boring, and the natural reaction to that is to create complicated designs. After all, if simple is boring, then complicated must be exciting, right? It may be, but only sometimes and only to some people. Oftentimes, the reality is that complex cards are either too unfocused to appeal to anyone, too complex to actually work, or too difficult for players to understand. This time I'll use a real card as the example. Meet the humble Summit Prowler. So let's take a look at this, right? So Summit Prowler, he's a creature yeti. Do not hunt the Yeti of the high peaks, right? So that's just a flavor text. We haven't got any special effects. He's just a 4/3 monster. In the expansion, there was a mechanic called Ferocious, which provided cards with additional or stronger effects. If you controlled at least one creature with power 4 or greater, you'll note that Summer Prowler has 4 power, so having it on the battlefield turns on your Ferocious card. Smooth and simple, just the way I like it. Summer Prowler is known as a vanilla card in Magic World. That is a card with no additional abilities or effects. To some people, that just isn't enough. You might imagine that a new designer would try to improve upon the design by adding in some sort of conditional effect, creating something like this. Okay, so he's made Shummet Schmowler. Whenever another creature you control dies, Shummet Schmowler gets +1/+1 until the end of the turn. And I've also noticed that he's lowered the power from a 4/3 to a 3/2. So by adding this conditional ability, I've given the card additional depth, but I've also made it a worse card. It may cost less to play, but the conditions... Oh, it costs less as well? Oh, okay, I didn't catch that bit. It may cost less to play, but the conditional nature of the ability means that it spends more of its time in a weaker state. It also makes it a lot harder for me to power up my Ferocious cards by demanding that I meet certain conditions at the right time. While it may seem like the design leads to more interesting and challenging gameplay, the real result is that players will pursue the path of least resistance and either not use Shummet Schmowler or not use it in conjunction with the Ferocious mechanic. In a roundabout way, I've actually made the game less interesting by making a card more complex. And yes, that makes perfect sense. You want a balance of complex and non-complex cards. If you need non-complex cards to bounce off of your complex cards, design your game to be a little bit that way, you know? I'm sure later on in Yu-Gi-Oh! They started introducing effects that would interact with non-effect monsters, therefore increasing the value of those. Suddenly the beat stick type monsters started becoming more mainstream again. They started actually having a need because you could bring them out, nice big attack, but then you would have something else that would interact with monsters that had no effects. It started to recreate that usefulness that the game needed because half of the cards just weren't useful. With card games in particular, it is possible to spread complexity across multiple cards that are meant to work in conjunction with each other, which I've already said. This is great. So in this scenario, rather than making any single card overly complex, a new designer might try to construct an intricate tapestry of relatively simple cards that come together to form a complex whole. This is actually something I addressed in the very first Talk TCG video I made. I was looking at that video because I thought, could I do a review of my very first one just to see how far I've came from there and whether things have changed. I in the end, I didn't go with that one because I didn't think it would be an interesting enough video. There's not really enough controversy there. Though any given card may be within acceptable complexity boundaries, this too is a flawed approach. Okay, interesting. So, firstly, the designer is falsely assuming that players will read the cards in the same way that they do and understand that they are meant to be used together in a specific way. Secondly, the designer may make a certain card very powerful to encourage the use of a strategy or combo, only to find that they've made those cards so powerful that players are exploiting them in ways that designers didn't intend because they tunnel visioned on their masterpiece. Finally, the cards may be a niche and so custom built for the one strategy that was intended for them that they either don't ever get used, or players are forced to create a very specific deck, thus removing a lot of the fun and challenging decision making that goes into the deck building process. Well, yes and no. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a bit of a slippery slope fallacy. So we're still talking about the cards dividing up the effects so then they work together as one unit, essentially. So yes, this does encourage decks being built in certain ways. You know, metas form because you get these things that are joined together. The designer could have tunnel vision with when it comes to it, but as a designer, it is also your responsibility to look for these things. It is not always a case of you will always catch things, but you need to be very aware of what you are creating. So it is a bit of an example of a slippery slope fallacy, because if I had two cards for an example, one card could say when it is destroyed you can draw a card. Another card could say that when a card is destroyed, you can take a card from your graveyard type area and put it on the top of your deck. Therefore, you are moving a card to the top of your deck and then you get to draw a card. So that's a way of combining things. It's a way of getting something back from like your graveyard or your out of play pile or whatever you name it. Now, I wouldn't consider either of those effects overpowered, and I wouldn't consider them to have to work together. They are still very open effects. You can take either one of those cards and put them in any other deck. It's a nice combination to have together because you're getting an instant draw and you're getting something out of your out of play area or graveyard and straight back into your hand, which is nice. But that is just one example I'm giving. It seems like a safe way of doing things. Just be careful with what you are designing as effects. I mean, if you have certain effects that you're unsure about, put them in the comment section below. Let's have a little read of them all together and let's see what we think about these effect combinations to see if maybe they are overpowered. But I think the key is when you are designing cards, don't try to force everything together. If you find a certain effect that you think is fun, try to think how it can play off it, but in a loose sense. You want your cards to also be independent. If you make a card that has to have another card to work with it, then that isn't fun. You need your cards to be their own individual card, to stand on their own and build their own decks around them. As long as you keep to just that one rule, you're probably on a safe journey to creating your own TCG. And with that, I will say that this is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.